Hey Dave, how are you?
Hey Matt, how are you?
Good. All right, so we can introduce you here. We are excited to hear from Dave Wascha today. He's currently the Chief Product and Technology Officer at Zoopla, based in London, England. Dave was the first speaker at the Mind and Product and has a great deal of experience addressing the issues we currently face as we take our journey from project to product thinking. Feel free to ask questions throughout Dave's talk, and we'll leave room at the end for him to answer these live. Just leave your questions right at the bottom of the hammer, and I will turn it over to you, Dave. See you in a little bit.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Matt. And hello, everyone, joining us this morning. I hear it's pretty chilly, and apparently you're also fraught with some rolling power outages. I'm coming to you live from London, England today. I am a Midwest boy, grew up in Flint, Michigan. I followed a woman over to the UK who is now my wife, and that's how I ended up here. But it's great to be speaking to you back in the US, in the Midwest today. Although it's from the sounds of it, I won't say that I wish I could be there with you in person. Maybe we'll leave that for the summer when things are a little bit crazy. I'm here today because, Cerner, you have a problem. Whether you know it or not, you've got a problem. You are dealing with something that I like to call product market drift. And we'll get into a little bit more about what product market drift is in a minute, but in order to discuss it, we have to first understand what product market fit is. Now, a tech company like Cerner, no doubt, is well aware of the concept of product market fit. For the few of you out there who may not be familiar with it, it's a very simple concept. It was coined, most people attribute it to Mark Andreessen, who was the founder of Netscape, one of the original web browsers. Probably predates many of you before even you were even born. But he simply defined product market fit as as a company, there's a problem that a customer wants solved, and there's a problem that you happen to solve. And if you can find the intersection between those two things, you've got something called product market fit. Now, that is the thing that many companies out there seek. And the industry is filled with these epic stories of companies who have done these epic pivots, these massive changes to their companies in pursuit of product market fit. Some of my favorite massive pivots, include Slack. If you're familiar with Slack, a messaging platform, I know it's not the one that Cerner uses, but it's a popular one out there. Slack actually started off as a gaming company. The tool we now know as Slack was actually an internal messaging tool designed by a company called Glitch, which was meant to be a massive online game, and ultimately became the company we now know as Slack. Flickr, I'm sure many of you remember Flickr. Flickr started off also as an online role-playing game and ultimately turned into one of the early ways to start sharing your photographs. It was a company called Ludicorp at the time, actually. Twitter started life as a podcasting app, in fact, called Odeo. Instagram was just a shameless ripoff of Foursquare called Bourbon. I think we're probably all familiar with the background of Facebook and its origin, but it was an app for basically college men to look at college women in the early days, and it's turned into the global platform with over 3 billion users that we know today. YouTube started off as a video dating company called TuneIn and Hook Up. And I bet many of you did not actually know that. My favorite pivot, however, and I think one of the best pivots in history, one of the best pivots in all of humanity, was the pivot of a company called Kutal. Now, in the late 19th century, Kutal sold wall cleaner. It was a putty. And while all of these houses were being heated with coal, the soot from the coal got all over the walls and all over the ceiling of the homes that it was warming. And so Kutal sold this putty that you rolled around on the wall to get the soot off the wall. But as the country started to shift away from coal to gas, natural gas, wood-burning fireplaces, etc., as a way of heating its homes, the Kutal really was struggling to continue to sell this product. They essentially were getting disrupted out of an industry. And they made, as I said, my favorite pivot in the history of pivots. They transitioned their company into the company that we now know as Play-Doh, near and dear to us all, near and dear to our hearts. They've sold over 3 billion cans of Play-Doh worldwide since they made that pivot at the beginning of the 20th century. So we we celebrate these epic pivots and we lionize them, but really these are companies that all struggled to find product market fit. They really started a company that ultimately wasn't solving a problem that their customers had. So the good news is that Cerner clearly has product market fit. And for over 40 years, Cerner has been a wildly successful company. You've got nearly 30,000 employees. And last year you did nearly $6 billion in global revenue. And I was taking a look at your most recent earnings, your recent earnings report, and things are looking really good for Cerner as it goes. It's been a wildly successful company. However, the bad news is that as any successful company, you are dealing with fighting against product market drift. All successful companies need to fight against this. Now, my definition of product market drift is very simply the tendency over time for companies to fail to respond to the changing needs and tastes of their customers. And there are a number of factors that drive this product market drift. And those are the things that I want to talk about it today, because no matter how innovative and how progressive or not Cerner is internally, any company that's been this successful and of this size is constantly going to be fighting against product market drift. And so I want to kind of paint a picture for you of some of the things to watch out for in the hallmarks of this insidious, challenging situation that we find ourselves in dealing with product market drift. This is what it looks like, really, as over time, if you think product market drift, over time, you see the evolution of companies like Slack, who today are doing incredibly successful. You see Facebook is kind of drifting, right? Facebook has lost its way a little bit. It's actually in developed markets, it's starting to lose users and its membership. It's struggling to find engagement, and it has a couple of missteps along the way. I don't obviously need to paint the picture about Kodak to any of you and what happened to Kodak. But this to me is what it looks like when we have product market drift over time in an industry. The first hallmark of product market drift, the first thing to look out for is what I call diffusion of focus. And that's one of the things that starts to pull this intersection, this connection of product market drift apart between companies. And the typical growth pattern that a company experiences, and if you look back at over the 40-year history of Cerner, actually it follows this growth pattern incredibly well. In the beginning, you've got product market fit. You've got a product that's successful. If it wasn't successful, you wouldn't survive as a company. And in the beginning, it's amazing. You've got one job for one brief moment. Your only job in the world is to serve the customer. Her wish is our command. But that moment is fleeting, because as soon as you have product market fit, what do you need to do? You need to tell as many people about it as possible. So you hire a marketing team. And their job isn't to solve the customer's problems. Their job is to find new customers. And so you continue to grow. And over time, they now need to go out and do their marketing job. And again, their job is to solve the problem of awareness, not to actual solve the problems of customers. So they come to the product teams and they say, hey, we need some help. We need some features to measure the effectiveness of our marketing efforts. And we need some tags for tracking on the pages. And we need some landing pages to support our campaigns. And so you start to carve off a little bit of your resource and a little bit of your focus away from solely focusing on the customer to supporting your marketing team. Now, there's nothing wrong with this. This is a natural evolution of any successful company. And so you've got your marketing team that you need to satisfy. But over time, as you continue to be successful, you're going to look to continue to grow. And so you go in search of new customers in other countries, in other geographies. And in fact, I think Cerner's in nearly 30 other geographies that they've gotten into over time, 27,000 locations around the world. And so you hire sales and marketing teams in other places, and things are great. And they come and they say, hey, where did you guys get those cool landing pages? And they say that the marketing team said, we would like some of those, and we'd like you to localize some of the features that we have. And we've got some other geographic specific features. So suddenly now you're dividing your time amongst more people who aren't the customer. And as you continue to grow, you then saturate your markets, you grow geographically, and now you need to look to ship other products. So you look to extend your product line. And so you further start to divide your time amongst more and more things, and less of that time focused on serving your customers. So you've got all of these stakeholders to continue to manage over time. And then as growth starts to slow down, you start to think, okay, well, if growth, is really about profit, and profit has both a profit and a loss element, or there's a cost element, maybe we can continue to grow financially by reducing our cost. And so you look for ways to manage cost, and that's where you become more and more internally focused on solving the problems of your company and less about solving the problems of your customer. And at the end of the day, you have precious little time to spend serving the person that made you successful in the first place. So diffusion of focus is the first of these insidious anti-patterns that we see in any successful company as it continues to grow. Nextly, I want to talk a little bit about inertia, or status quo bias, some people like to call it. Humans don't like change. Humans were evolutionarily designed not to want to take in new information. It's a biologically expensive process to create new connections and synapses in the brains. And so we try as we might to avoid it at all costs, unless we absolutely have to take in this new information. We don't like to change the way that we behave as humans, and we certainly don't like to change the way that we behave as groups of humans. And so inertia can pull us even further away from our customers. My favorite example of the insidiousness of inertia is asking the question, why do we have a 5-day work week? And in order to answer the question, why do we have a 5-day work week, you first have to answer the question, why do we have a 7-day week? Well, very simply put, 3,000 years ago, we have a 7-day week because the Babylonians looked up in the sky 3,000 years ago and they saw 7 different planets. And they said, great, that must be a sign from the gods on high that we should divide time into 7 units, into 7 days in the week. Now, that makes perfect sense until you figure out that there are not 7 planets. In fact, there are 8 planets. And therefore, kind of throwing the whole logic behind that decision to have 7 days in the week kind of out of whack. It doesn't make any sense anymore. So then you have to ask why. Okay, so we've got a 7-day work week, or rather work week, misattributed to the number of planets in the sky. Why do we have a 5-day work week? What about those other 2 days? And it turns out that during the Industrial Revolution, late 19th century, early 20th century, the church was experiencing a drop in its attendance. It was on Sunday, people were allowed not to go to work in order to go to church, but the church was experiencing a drop in its attendance. And so it tried to figure out what was going on, and it realized that people weren't going to church because they were too hungover to go to church, because they spent Saturday night, the only night that they had during the week where they didn't have to get up and go to work in the morning, they spent it drinking out in the bars and pubs. And so the church made a deal with industry to say, look, give people Saturday off so that they can go out and get drunk on Friday night, and then hopefully they can be sober enough and not hungover on Sunday morning so that they can go to church. So that is the largely arbitrary reason why we have 2 days of a weekend and a 5-day work week. Now, in spite of the fact that for the next 100 years, we've got overwhelming evidence that actually a 5-day work week, a 40-hour week, makes absolutely no sense. It certainly makes no sense in the 21st century, given how we all work today. And it's actually biologically, psychologically, it's not how we're meant to work as human beings, but we continue to do that every day, even all these years later, because of inertia, because of this status quo bias. So we've got, for no good reason, we've got a 5-day work week because the Babylonians couldn't see Neptune, and these guys were too hungover to go to church. That's the only reason why we have a 5-day work week, for no better reason than that. And yet it dictates how we work today to the nth degree. Now, I have one bone to pick here, which is I will always claim Pluto in my heart will always be an actual proper planet. I don't care what anyone says about it. So there are actually 9 planets, if you ask me. But certainly the Babylonians couldn't see Pluto either. So inertia, it's when you hear that excuse for someone, that's the way we've always done it, not adapting to new information, not adapting to the changing tastes and wants and needs of an industry or your customers. That's another thing that really drives product market drift for successful companies. The third thing that I want to talk about is risk aversion. And really, risk aversion is one of those things that, again, drives that product market drift. It splits the problem, it moves you further away from solving the problems that your customers want solved. We try to put everything in spreadsheets. We've got precious few resources, and we're under pressure and time and resource constraints. And we're forced to demonstrate the explicit and predictable value of everything that we do in these elaborate business cases and arduous gating processes and the like. And not only does this slow us down, but this creates a culture of systematic risk aversion and constrains our thinking to small, predictable additions that create small incremental gains. And it's one of these things that, many times if you have an experimentation-focused culture, making a business case for doing something now will take longer than actually running the experiment and seeing the actual result. The risk and the cost of doing these things is incredibly low, but as we become more successful, we try to hang on to that success. We become more risk averse, and we start to solve for predictability more than we do continuing to innovate and solving our customers' problems. So risk aversion and a culture of risk aversion is another one of these hallmarks of companies that are fighting product market drift. Now, it gets worse. Product market drift is, in fact, accelerating. A little more than a decade ago, the iPhone had just come out. If you think about it, really, it's amazing how far we've come. Today, your customers are live tweeting from their Fitbit about how many calories they burned today, riding on their Peloton and the virtual Tour de France in virtual reality. Well, they're also tracking the precise GPS coordinates via satellite of the delivery guy bringing their dinner to them that they ordered on their phone 20 months ago, where they're live streaming that, checking Instagram and binge watching the Game of Thrones. That's all happened in the last 10 years, that amount of innovation, and it's only speeding up. If you look at the average lifespan of an S&P 500 company, it's shrinking over time. In 1920, you could expect to be there for over 6 decades. Now, the best of companies are barely managing 2 decades on the S&P 500 before they get disrupted, before they succumb to product market drift. If in the 20th century, the curve for drift looked like what I showed you earlier, I would surmise that now in the 21st century, it's even more dire. And it makes it even more important that companies build up their resilience to these forces of product market drift. The last challenge here is that the barriers to entry, the barriers to someone coming along and serving your customers better than you do are dropping. The world's largest companies like Amazon and Google are making it effectively free for you to start a global company to compete on any scale. You no longer have the barrier to entry of having to build massive data centers and hire thousands of people in order to build successful companies. You can do it quite literally from a garage with a global presence and global scale built on all of these cloud-based services. So the barriers to entry for new competition are lower than they've ever been in human history. So what do we do about this? How do we fight the product market drift? Well, we need to remember that this is really about culture. And based on the conversations that I've had, Cerner's got a very powerful culture and a global culture. But fighting product market drift is, at the end of the day, about culture. And let's remember that culture is the collective manifestation of the individual behaviors, the celebrations, the incentives, the rituals, and the language people use of a company. That's all culture is. And so you need to figure out a way of building the resilience to product market drift into your culture. So how do we do that? Well, with all of the companies that I work for, and I've worked with many companies like Cerner, successful global companies who have grown and been successful, but are now trying to figure out ways to really build robust resilience to product market drift. You have to return to first principles. You have to return to basics. You have to return to what made the company successful in the first place. You have to return to asking the question of everything that we do, what is in it for the customer? How are you representing the customer? You succumb to the diffusion of focus, and you're now solving all kinds of internal problems for the company. You need to make sure that the customer becomes an active part of the decision. Are you bringing the customer back into the discussion? Now, Apple. We think of Apple as people who listen to the customer, don't we? But not always the case. I would have ventured to guess that many of you have had to deal with at least one of these. You've probably had to deal with one where you lost it and you had to go pay $30 to get a new one. Nobody liked this. Nobody wanted this. This was Apple solving one of Apple's problems. This is one of those things that large companies start to do. Even the most successful companies in the world that we hold up as success stories are companies that succumb to drift, and Apple is no different from the rest of us. One of my favorite companies, however, that really does a good job of this is Zappos. They constantly keep the customer squarely in part of the conversation. And if you haven't used Zappos, or if you're not familiar with them, go take a look. Zappos revolutionized the soft goods e-commerce industry at a time when many of the companies in the world were goaling their internal customer service departments on avoiding returns. And they were actually rewarded for minimizing the number of returns that people had for soft goods, so for clothing and for shoes and for things like that. Things that are really hard to shop for online if you can't actually feel them and look them and see them and try them on. Zappos turned that completely on its head. They were the first company to come up with a policy that said you've got a year to return your purchase. They sent a return shipping label with their every product that they sent out. And overnight, they saw massive success. They saw people ordering 2 or 3 different sizes of the same shoe, like you would if you went into a store. And they would return the ones that didn't fit. And Zappos actually encouraged this. And Zappos is now one of the great success stories in e-commerce history because they managed to build into their culture, into those individual decisions they were making on a daily basis, kind of making sure that they always ask the question, what's in it for the customer? Are we solving our problem? Like Apple coming up with weird kind of adapters to kind of, because they didn't like how a mini jack fit into the design of their iPhone, to really focus on what's in it for the customer. And Zappos is a great success story there. Facebook, again, we think of Facebook as a success story, but they're slipping. They're really succumbing to the drift. They're succumbing to the kind of needs of their shareholders. And they're doing really, in many cases, unethical and bad things in service of it, right? They're really struggling with drift right now. And they're one of the largest and most successful companies in the history of humanity. Disney is a success story, and Disney has managed over the last 6 decades of building some of the best entertainment parks on the planet to continue on a daily basis to innovate. And if you've taken your family, and I recognize many of us won't have done this recently since lockdown, but if you've taken your family and you've gotten one of these wristbands, it opens up a completely different experience for visiting the park. You don't need to worry about standing in queues. You kind of have pre-held spots in queues. This wristband opens the doors. It pays for everything. It tells you where you've been. It allows you to make reservations. 60 years later, when they're wildly successful and they could rest on their laurels, they continue to push forward, always trying to solve the customer's problems. Evernote, again, you probably think of Evernote as a successful company, but Evernote has really struggled with product market drift. They continue to struggle with how to make money because they've never figured out what their customers are willing to pay money for. They continue to change how they charge for their products, and it frustrates people and it confuses people, and they're not actually doing a very good job of delivering value for customers. And customers are left wanting and confused about, okay, well, what am I paying for and why? And I found this in one of the press releases that Evernote put out about why they're changing their pricing. And I'm always struck by this. Effectively, I'll read, you could read it yourself, but Evernote says that these pricing changes reflect the significant investment of energy, time, and money that's put into offering the service that it's committed to, never relying on ads or selling user data to sustain its business. In other words, they want you to pay them more money because they're trying really hard. And if that doesn't convince you, then they're putting in a mild veiled threat that they're going to start to sell your information if you don't start to give them money for the product that you've been using for free for the last 12 years. This is a company succumbing to drift, a company that we all probably think is a successful company. Netflix is one of my favorite examples of a company that has resisted drift over time. It's reinvented itself 3, arguably 4 different times. It's done everything. It's disrupted multiple industries, from the kind of the cassette tape rental industry all the way through to the entertainment industry and the streaming industry and everything in between. It's an amazing success story. I'm sure many, if not all of you, are customers of Netflix. But the thing that I love about Netflix is that it's managed to build into its culture, continuing to say, what are we doing for our customers? Many of you will have seen this feature pop up in the last 6 to 8 months, depending on which version of the product that you're using. And I love this feature. I love it, A, because it's handy, but B, because it just tells me that they're constantly trying to figure out how to make their customers' experiences better. They clearly have watched, either literally watched or through the telemetry that they have in their system, people try and skip through the intro of all the TV shows that they're binging. After the 6th or 7th episode in a 6-hour binge, you've seen the intro enough times you don't need to watch it. So, but you also have experienced like fast forwarding it. You fast forward and then you actually get too far in and you've actually now into the program, so they need to back up, and then you're too far back into the intro again. They spend more time trying just to get to the beginning of the show than they would had they just watched the intro. So all these years later, having reinvented themselves 4 different times and disrupted multiple global industries, Netflix is still very focused culturally on always solving their customers' problems. And I just love to see these little indications of that all the time. Now, I don't mean to say that any of this is easy, right? If you look at this path that we're all on, trying to balance between the value for the customer, right? Doing what's right for the customer, but also the value for your company and your shareholders, doing what's right for the company. You'd like to think that it's a very simple line and that we can all just make our journey at our successful companies look like this. But you know, the reality of this looks a lot more like this. This isn't easy. And I'm not pretending that it's easy. You know, you're listening to me give you a quick talk on your Tuesday morning, and we're all going to go back to our day jobs after this. I'm not implying this is easy. You have the hard job of making this happen. And this isn't something that happens from the top down. This isn't something that a CEO can dictate. Again, culture is the collective manifestation of the individual behaviors of every employee. And it has to come from the bottom. And if you aren't trying to change your culture to make sure that you're always thinking about solving that customer problem, then you're going to succumb to product market drift. So you always need to be asking, what's in it for the customer? And you need to do that by listening to them and to understand what they want. Your customers are screaming, whether you're listening or not. They are screaming. It's easier now, in an hour of sitting at your desk, to do really in-depth research about your product, your industry, your sector, your domain, than it ever has been in history. You can do more now in an hour than you could have done 10 years ago in weeks or months with millions of pounds of research budget. And you could do it all from your desk. Now, you might say, well, I'm at Cerner and we are a B2B business. And so we're an enterprise B2B business. And so we don't actually get to interact with our customers. I don't buy it. I don't agree with it. Like, you can understand what your customers and or your end users care about through desktop research, through looking at reviews of similar products that solve the same problem, similar companies, etc. And you probably have all kinds of rich feedback loops built into Cerner itself. Each and every one of you is responsible for going and finding that information and digesting it and using it to make decisions internally to make sure that you're, again, shifting your culture to always be focusing on and considering what's in it for the customer. So there's no excuse in 2021, even though if we're all locked in our houses and locked down, there's no excuse for not listening to your users, listening to your end users, listening to your customers. Monzo is a company based in the UK. It's a challenger bank. It's an app-only bank. It's a really cool company. And they make their roadmaps public. They actually let the public create it. They let their users create online their roadmap, and they publish it to anyone who wants to see what's coming, including their competitors, and then let people vote on it. They do a great job of making it completely transparent for their customers and for everybody else. And they use that as a great input from their customers to listen to their customers. So listening to your customer is, again, another key. You need to ask what's in it for the customer, and you need to listen to the customer to understand what their problems are. And you need to observe the customer, and you need to make sure that you have the data that you need. You've got the telemetry in your systems to understand things like, how do you measure a happy customer? What in your data gives you indications that you are being successful, right? And if you don't have the telemetry, you don't have the tags, you don't have the the optics built into your products, you need to. It's an investment that you need to make. You will not survive as a company in the 21st century if you don't have these feedback loops in your products that are helping you understand people's engagement, their behavior, and ultimately, are they happy with your product? So ask yourselves the question, how do you measure a happy customer? Can you? Do you know what the definition of that is internally? If it isn't, I think it's a probably good thing to spend some time discussing as a company, in your teams, in your products, in your divisions. How do you measure it? The second most important thing when it comes to data is that everyone needs access to it, right? It's not something that data used to be this kind of precious thing that was held by the data team or the analyst team or the corporate strategy team. But modern companies in the 21st century, every person in the business, no matter what their job is, needs to be using data and have access to this data in order to drive their daily decisions. And so, A, you need the data. So if you don't have that telemetry built into their systems, you need to. And you need to demand it. But B, everyone also needs access to it, right? They need easy access to self-serve when it comes to data. And then you need to ask yourselves a question in every meeting and in every interaction that you have. How do we use data in our decision making? Are we using data in the right ways? There are plenty of wrong ways to use data. There are all kinds of human follies that we succumb to as human beings. We don't like to take in new data, as I talked about. We don't like to disagree with people. It's particularly bad in the UK, I have to say. As an American in the UK, no one here wants to disagree with anyone. And that often leads to really bad decision making, even in the face of having the right kind of data. So having a discussion around how you make decisions as a company is an incredibly important thing to do. So my wish for you, Cerner, as a wildly, by any measure, successful company in the 21st century, 40 successful years, massive growth, 30,000 employees, 6 billion in revenue. My wish for you is that each and every one of you really starts to think about the definition of culture. Culture is the collective manifestation of all of the behaviors, all of the activities, all of the individual actions of each and every one of you. And if you want to continue to be a wildly successful company, and if you want to fight against product market drift, you need to be very intentional about this. And you need to be very intentional about remembering who got you where you are in the first place. And that person is the customer. And that is the person that you need to constantly be thinking of throughout your day and throughout your week. So with that, I will say thank you for that. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my thoughts on product market drift. Matt, I don't know if we have any questions, but I'm more than happy to take them now. Yep. If anyone had any.
For sure, yeah. And folks, there's a little bit of a delay, but drop your questions below as well as we jump into the Q&A here, and we will get to them as we go. But we have a few lined up for you here. So we have a question here. Roughly, how much % capital should an entrenched company that has already experienced product market drift fit spend on a pure experimentation into potential new product lines, etc.?
Wow, that could be a very small or a very big question. I wonder if it came from somebody in finance or the corporate strategy department. Lots of different companies take different approaches to this. I mean, the nice thing about Cerner is clearly massively profitable business, not worried about burn rates and run rates and making payroll, right? You theoretically have the money to make these longer term investments on longer term time horizons. And clearly any company that's been around for, what will be soon half a century has been thinking on longer term time horizons. I really like the way that we approached it when I worked at Microsoft, and I worked there for 14 years. And I actually got to work with Satya Nadella, who's the CEO now. He wasn't the CEO when I worked there, but he's he totally deserves to be one of the most amazing humans I've ever met. But his approach was very clear. We made sure that we spent 10% again, 10% of what is an important question, but 10% of R&D on long-term time horizons, or what we called high beta or higher risk investments, right? Things that wasn't clear if it was going to come of anything. And then we would spend 30% on medium-term time horizons. So product line extension, product line growth, trying to attract new customers, running experiments in adjacent industries. And, so moving, if you think about in the early days of Microsoft, if they started with Microsoft Word and Excel, like adding in PowerPoint or something would be an example of continuing to grow into adjacent markets where your existing customers, you were solving a related problem that they were already using another product for. But then the bulk, and at Microsoft, I believe this continues to be the case, 60% of the R&D spend is about just serving your customers that you have today. And again, there aren't that many companies on the planet that have the luxury of being able to make those kinds of investments. Cerner is certainly one of them. But I really found that to be a really thoughtful and balanced approach to things. I would imagine if you looked at the way Netflix invests, it's probably way more than 10 or 30% in terms of forward looking. I don't know exactly, but that's a really interesting question.
Awesome. Cool. And we got another one here. What advice do you have for helping engineering and product management balance and normalize their working relationship?
The age-old question. Fighting between product management and tech. I deal with this in my day job all the time. In fact, I was dealing with it before I joined this call. I think the challenge, again, between product and tech is often one of time horizons. Incentives, and accountability. Actually, you could extend this to include marketing and sales for that matter, right? If you think about the kind of shortest time horizons that somebody's focused on, it could be marketing or sales. They're out there to drive a campaign today, this week, this month. Product management might be looking 3, 6, 9, 12 months ahead in terms of the kinds of things you need to deliver, whilst tech might be making massive investments in infrastructure that will only start to yield real benefit and ROI 6, 12, 18, or 24 months down the road. And so a lot of the tension that arises is merely because the time horizons on which people are prioritizing and making investments are not aligned. And subsequently, also, the incentives that people had are not aligned. But I think the thing that product managers probably don't appreciate enough is also this element of accountability, right? The accountability that tech has. Tech has the accountability for making sure that the site doesn't go down. Tech has the accountability for making sure that the service is always up, that you don't have a data breach, that you deal in highly sensitive information, right? This is a very serious consideration for a company like Cerner. And so tech has to deal with these issues that product doesn't need to deal with. And so that leads, again, to a lot of tension because there's a fear, and a healthy fear, I think, on the part of tech in wanting to avoid these very bad things. Whereas product is trying to think about the new things and the next new things. And so I think if product, now listen, all you engineers out there, don't go pointing the finger at your product counterparts because I said this. But I mean, product does need to develop some empathy for a lot of the things that the engineering teams need to contend with that product doesn't need to consider. The best product managers take into account all of those NFRs, those non-functional requirements, as we would call them, around security, around paying down tech debt, around maintaining technical health, around all of those things. They're a natural part of the conversation, the backlog and the prioritization process, that conversation that happens between product and tech. The best product managers are really on top of that, and it's not an issue. But where I see a lot of tension arise is when there's all this misalignment, there's no empathy from one, eng looking at product or the other way around. And then the worst case is when incentives are really out of whack. That's when you see the worst challenges. So it's tough. You got to develop your relationships. You have to develop trust. You got to make those investments. It's harder to do when we're all remote. But it's something that if you're going to develop that culture of resistance, that robust culture of resisting product market drift, those are the kinds of behaviors that we all need to undertake.
For sure. Okay, so we got a decent amount more questions rolling in here. Okay, so it seems like product market drift is inevitable, almost like aging. Isn't fighting it like prescribing a cure, new solution against aging? Sure, we have companies that fight it successfully, but how can most companies even succeed in fighting it?
Yeah, so it's good, and I try to balance when I have this discussion with companies. It does sound like it's this inevitable demise of a company. I don't believe that to be the case. And if you look at the exceptions, if you look at the most successful companies, if you look at Amazon or Netflix or companies like that, they reinvent themselves. They're able to reinvent themselves because of their culture, and their culture has these common elements that I pointed out today, which is no matter what happens, no matter what decade they're in, no matter what sector that they're in, they're always making sure that they spend a decent portion of their time focused on their customer. Drift is when you start to get distracted away from the customer. And the last thing that you spend so little time actually thinking about the customer, even if you're Apple, because Johnny Ives doesn't like the shape of a 3.5 millimeter mini jack in his beautiful iPhone design, right? And so they piss everybody off around the world with these stupid dongles that you keep losing and paying $30 for. So I don't want it to sound inevitable. The reason I give this talk, it's meant to be a bit of a talk filled with hope, because I believe it's possible. It's hard, to be very clear. It's hard. When I talk to companies like this, I want to be clear. This isn't the job of leadership to fix this, right? They can't. And in many cases, they're the people that are the most disconnected from customers. And the cynics amongst you are probably rolling your eyes and saying, "Oh, that's what it's like here." But that's what it's like everywhere, I promise you. And so it's meant to be filled with hope. The responsibility lies with you. You can't be victims of, well, that's happening to us. We have no agency. We have no control over this. We can't get the data. No one wants to listen to us. We can't get access to customers. None of that's true. 10 years ago, a lot of that was true. Now, in February of 2021, you do not have that excuse. None of that is true. So I don't believe it's inevitable. It is a bit like aging, except if doing yoga and exercise kept you young. Maybe. And what I'm saying is figuring out how to do the downward facing dog as a company every morning as your yoga ritual.
Yeah, for sure. All right. So what are just some good strategies to handle a lot of very different requests from many users / clients? How do we keep focus while still keeping as many users happy as we can?
Yeah, this is it's an interesting one. It's one of the perennial challenges that you hear. It's about prioritization, and there are a million techniques. It's probably not within the scope of this call to go in depth into any of the techniques. I've been a fan of using the ICE or the RICE technique. Look it up. Prioritization. It really just says if you could give a weighted stack rank to the list of things that you're considering doing, it really just says do the stuff that it impacts the greatest number of people the greatest amount possible, if I were to grossly oversimplify it. There are techniques. I'm a big fan of a company called Mind the Product. They have a bunch of free online learning up there. They go into a lot of detail, and there's lots of talks on prioritization. But I think for the purposes of this talk, or relative to this talk, I think one of the things I would say is a lot of the prioritization discussions you end up having when you're fighting drift are around prioritizing things that are solving the company's problems versus things that are solving the customer's problems, right? And you can hear, when you hear the language like, we've got a conversion problem, or we've got a profit problem, or we've got, that's the language that people use when they're trying to solve the company's problem. And it's so if you're having these discussions around prioritization, again, go back to that very simple question. And I say this, and people are like, well, they said, yeah, but really tell me what you're saying. And I'm like, no, the thing I'm actually saying is ask the question, what's in it for the customer? Which of these things has the greatest impact for the greatest number of customers? Now, I know that sounds simple. It's hard to do in practice, but that is really what you have to do. And it's hard to do. That's why so few companies are successful in doing it. But that's not something that can get handed down to you from the leadership. It's something that each of you has to deal with on a daily basis yourselves.
Exactly. Okay, so we got two more. Here we go. So when data is presented in supporting a decision for a production direction, are there ways you have found effective to test that it isn't too selective and enabling a confirmation bias?
Yeah, this is an interesting one. It's a really good question, because data can be used in all the wrong ways to serve agendas and further politics and all kinds of stuff. There was a period of time at Microsoft in probably the middle 2000s, where you'd come in with this massive stack of printed out graphs and stuff, and you drop it on the desk, and then the other side of the argument would come in and drop a bigger stack of paper on, and it'd be like the data wars, and whoever had the most data won. Again, I think there's there's a ton of really interesting learning study, but psychological studies around how human groups make decisions. And there's a bunch of things that they've called out confirmation bias. I mean, are clearly familiar with the concept of cognitive biases. There are a bunch that impact how groups make decisions. I talked earlier about the difference between decision making in a group in the UK. My experience as an American in the UK. People in the UK are really solved for social cohesion far more than people in America do in the US. They want everyone to be happy. That they're fine if the decision's bad as long as no one feels bad about the decision. And so social cohesion again is one of those things that it's served us as humans really well. It's meant to allow people in tribes of humans to survive as a tribe, right? And so it's built into us evolutionarily in our DNA to try to at least achieve a certain level of social cohesion. But in the 21st century, that doesn't necessarily mean we're going to be making really good business decisions. I think one of the things I typically do, and again, this is a deep topic that we could spend a lot of time on. But one of the things I like to do is just assign a devil's advocate. Or if you've read any of the like Six Hats of Edward de Bono, any of his books, the black hat, right? Assign someone whose only job is to refute the primary argument, whose only job is to question, where'd you get that data? Where did it come from? How do you know it's valid? Whose only job is to be really annoying, frankly. But they're there in service of making a better decision. Because left to our own devices, we're terrible. We're terrible at taking in data and making decisions. And as groups, it's just more compounded, right? It's worse. And so you have to be familiar with the foibles of making decisions as a group. Tons of books on this. Go and read about the Challenger disaster, the space shuttle disaster in 1986. And all the human group decision making that went into making that really bad decision about allowing the Challenger to launch that day. It's astounding. I was about to say it's a case study. It is a case study in poor decision making as groups of humans. But clearly, I have a lot of passion about this. I could go on for a long time. But I will leave you on this question with this: just assign a devil's advocate to any decision that's important.
Sure. Awesome. So we got one more question here. We can jump to Laura's question, then we can wrap up. How do you typically work with user experience design teams and human factors researchers to prevent product market drift?
I think if you're lucky as a company and you have the good fortune to have kind of UX researchers and UX practitioners and product designers, you're one step ahead of a lot of companies out there to begin with, and it's genuinely a luxury. I think. Whilst I think it's everybody's responsibility to bring the customer into the discussion, including engineers, and I get this a lot from engineers saying, well, I do my engineering job, and so I don't need to worry about the customer. I disagree, just patently disagree with anyone who has that attitude. But I think, you could really look to rely on product designers, UX researchers to try and synthesize and do a good job of advocating for and representing the customer. I think the best product teams, and here I'm using product team as, I don't know what you call them at Cerner, but like the cross-functional team of people that build products or services, the best product teams have these people embedded in them and are constantly, they're overworked because they're constantly oversubscribed on all of the things the questions that people have and the kind of studies that they want to go do and the usability studies they want to go do and everything else. Having said that, I strongly believe that you don't get to outsource that. What at my company, we call it firsthand empathy, right? You're developing your firsthand empathy, your firsthand understanding of what the customer is trying to solve with your product. You don't get to outsource that to the researchers, right? I believe it's everyone's responsibility, but it's great and it's a luxury if you have professional researchers whose job is to try and bring this objective data into the decision-making process. So to answer the question, how do you work with them? As frequently as possible, as closely as possible, as often as possible.
Awesome. I think that wraps up it. David, thank you so much again for joining us and presenting on such a relevant topic and such an important topic that we got today. And it looks like you broke our live stream audience record as well. So you can put that on the resume.
Excellent. I will. I'll put it up on the website somewhere.
Awesome. Thank you so much again.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Genuinely, it's been a pleasure. The questions were amazing, very engaging, and I wish you the best of luck. I hope the rolling power outages aren't too bad. I hope you all manage to stay warm and healthy. And if you ever find yourself in London, look me up and I'll happily show you around.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dave.